Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabarty. We are coming to you live on Tuesday afternoon. Today is September 17th, and we are going to be breaking down what was an unbelievable Monday Night Football game between the Atlanta Falcons and Philadelphia Eagles, which saw one of the more improbable comebacks that we've seen in recent NFL history as the Falcons were able to pull off the upset win and maybe rejuvenate their season after what was a very disappointing week one. So we're going to be giving you all of the breakdown and takeaways from that game. We are then going to be talking about the Philadelphia Eagles loss, as well as a number of the other top teams in the NFL that did fall this past weekend. And we are going to be talking about what level of panic NFL fans should be having surrounding each of these teams that lost this past weekend. We will be looking at a little bit of a greater view of this past weekend in the NFL, talking about the biggest win, the worst loss, the best individual performance, and handing out all sorts of NFL Week 2 awards. We will then be moving on, and we will be talking about some of the key injuries that took place to some of the biggest fantasy football stars in the game, and we'll be talking about what the overall timelines look like there and what types of implications they may have on your fantasy football league. And then finally, to wrap up the show, we're actually going to be switching gears to the NBA as CBS Sports put out a very interesting tier list and ranking of all 30 NBA head coaches. We're going to be sharing our thoughts on that. So a whole lot to dive into, but before we do so, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. Be sure to leave a comment if you have any thoughts on the latest happenings in sports, whether it's just a quick thought that you had on any of the biggest games over the weekend, or just generally speaking in the sports world. If you have a thoughtful question or anything in between, let us know in the chat what your thoughts are, as we here at the GSMC Sports Podcast try and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can leave a comment along with a tip or donation using either the super chat feature that is available on YouTube, or you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be very greatly appreciated on either of those fronts. We're going to start off by diving into last night's Monday Night Football thriller between the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, you have probably seen the play by now. 1 minute and 46 seconds left in the game. The Eagles up by 3 points, 3rd and 3, and they decide to pass the ball. At this point, Falcons without a timeout, so no way to stop the clock. The Eagles decide to do a little rollout with Jalen Hurts to Saquon Barkley, and ultimately the play was scripted up beautifully. Saquon Barkley appeared to be wide open for an easy first down conversion, but he just couldn't bring it in. And I think that I'm really in the majority with what sounds like a lot of people's reactions are, and I just think that it is an awful decision to pass the ball in that situation. Now, in terms of an actual play design on a normal 3rd and short opportunity, I think that it is an excellent design there. Barkley was wide open in the flats. You also have Jalen Hurts rolling out in space to his right with the option to keep it himself. Obviously, Hurts keeping the ball himself was a very big part of the Eagles' game plan during last night's game, but I just think that it is inexcusable to run the risk of stopping the clock. And the reality is, in football, in all of sports, and in all of life, human error is just inevitable to some degree. And again, I think even opening the door of possibilities for the clock to stop there is a mistake. Now, you can start to play the hypothetical game in any which direction you may want to. if they end up running it there, the Falcons still get the ball back. They pretty easily drove down the field in 1 minute and 5 seconds. So you can try and make the argument that the Falcons would have scored anyways and the Eagles would have lost if they did in fact settle for the field goal, which, by the way, that's a whole nother conversation that people are talking about. Should the Eagles have gone for it on 4th and 3? I stand by the Eagles there. I think you got to take the points. You can't let a field goal beat you. So I'm with the Eagles on that. It's just, again, all of this building up just led to a very disappointing loss for the Eagles. And you know what? Credit Kirk Cousins and the Falcons. We're going to be talking about them a little bit more in the second half of this segment here. It was an excellent drive there. But on the other end as well, while we're on the note, especially with the Eagles coaching, I thought that all in all, this entire game had a lot of causes for concern in the coaching game, which is really what one of the biggest questions surrounding the Eagles was headed into this season. And Nick Sirianni obviously getting the majority of the blame this morning, and rightfully so to some degree. I do feel like people are omitting the fact that Sirianni is no longer the play caller. Now, I'm sure as the head coach, he still has final say in a lot of it, but Kellen Moore is actually the play caller for the Eagles. Sirianni, because of the sort of turmoil that was built up during the second half of last season, he gave up those responsibilities. New coordinators on both sides of offense and defense. So I do think that Kellen Moore as well definitely deserves some of the blame, but of course it's going to fall back on Sirianni for whatever it's worth. But I really didn't think that the coaching all night was good for the Eagles. Like I mentioned, excellent drive for Kirk Cousins to have his first signature moment with the Falcons, but I had a couple issues with the way that the Eagles played this game defensively on that drive and in this game altogether, where why are you giving such large cushions to the Falcons in that situation? I understand you don't want to get beat over the top. You understand that a touchdown beats you. But that being said, Kirk Cousins, he did not attempt one pass the entire night that was past 20 yards from the line of scrimmage, and that there were a number of moments where we saw Cousins being a little bit more hesitant of actually taking that deep shot. The broadcast crew on ESPN highlighted at one point he had Ray McLeod early in the game for what should have been a wide open break. They ended up going to Drake London instead for what was a big gain, but I think that Kirk is still a little bit gun shy in terms of testing out his full physical capacity as he recovers from that torn Achilles injury. And ultimately, I just thought that, sort of on that note as well, they should have been applying more pressure to Cousins. If you want to, obviously argue against that for the final drive, I'm with you. I'm not saying they had to blitz there necessarily, but throughout the game, they put no pressure on Kirk Cousins, who last week, when he faced pressure from the Pittsburgh Steelers, really struggled. And Vic Fangio, their new defensive coordinator, has a reputation over these past couple years that he does not like to blitz. The Dolphins were bottom 6 in blitz percentage last season. He did so actually ramp that up a little bit more in 2022 with the Broncos. They were top 4 in the league in blitz rate, but didn't pay off much. And in terms of the pressure stats or anything like that. So maybe that scared Fangio off, but through 2 games, the Eagles are currently 29th in the NFL in pressure rate and tied for last in yards per play allowed, according to Football Reference, which is those are some really bad numbers. And again, if you want to play a little bit more conservative, I'm not saying through the entirety of the season that can't be more so your identity, but to not put any pressure on Kirk Cousins, I think, is a mistake. And ultimately, the Eagles, in a number of different ways, sort of helped give this game to the Falcons. So just talk defensive game plan very quick on the offensive side of the ball. I think that it goes a little bit beyond the coaching itself. I didn't love the play calling for Philly in this game. It sort of piqued my interest on that first drive when they ran a QB draw on 3rd and 9. That was a little bit weird to me. And I think that it goes to speak a little bit that clearly the Eagles did not have all that much faith in their pass catchers. They were without A.J. Brown in this game, who's dealing with a hamstring injury, and they decided to go very heavy on the ground, understandably so. You have Saquon Barkley, and then Jalen Hurts also is still a very good runner. He rushed for 85 yards. I believe Saquon was at 95. So you got a really good rushing attack in this game, so that's great. But again, the third and long decision to do that sort of piqued my interest. And then during the game as well, a lot of RPOs. RPOs are a very well utilized thing in the NFL and in the college game. So it's not like I'm frowning upon the decision to use RPOs, but whether it is on Jalen Hurts or on the coaching, they picked up at least 3 ineligible man downfield penalties, which is as a result of Jalen Hurts holding onto the ball too long and then deciding to throw downfield. That ultimately you have Cam Jurgens was really the main culprit in this situation, but there was at least one play where it was a couple linemen that went downfield. You got to throw the ball quickly there before your linemen are getting downfield. They can't just sit back and be passive because there's also a chance you're running right behind them. So I don't know if that's more of a coaching point or more on a Jalen Hurts decision-making thing, but it was just a messy game, I thought, for the Eagles on a number of instances there. That being said, they still should have won the game, so it's not like I'm trying to skewer them, and we're going to talk about the panic meter for the Eagles as well as all the other biggest teams that lost this weekend. I don't think you need to be entirely up in arms with the Eagles, but again, like I mentioned at the top of the show, for whatever it's worth, the Eagles coaching is sort of one of the bigger storylines with this roster. It is a very talented team, and to have that type of a showing, I think, is a good amount concerning. Now, on the other side, like I mentioned, want to give Kirk Cousins credit because ultimately this Falcons season seemed like it was going to be in a downward spiral, and the Eagles may have done them a huge favor on that third down decision to help keep them alive because it seemed like Philly had it locked up. And, I was writing in my notes at the time during the watch where, well, the Falcons were still competitive in this game and they could maybe look to build momentum, but assuming the Eagles were just able to close that one out, the Falcons would have fallen to 0-2 in a division where the New Orleans Saints and Tampa Bay Buccaneers have been two of the most impressive teams through 2 weeks, and to fall 0-2, that could have been potentially detrimental for their playoff hopes. And now instead, they get an incredible comeback win that sort of raises the morale of the entire team, sort of lifts the monkey off the back of Kirk Cousins, who seemed like he might have been getting booed out of Atlanta if things continued to go poorly, and then Raheem Morris, who I do just love as a coach, and I have very high expectations for him, but it would have been definitely disappointing to have the season start like this after they did gain so much momentum, it felt like, during the offseason. So, it wasn't a perfect game for them. I especially thought on the offensive side of the ball, the first half was shaky. But what we saw in the second half was sort of the recipe of success for this team. It was feeding Bijan Robinson and that run game. I especially loved the drive coming into the second half where they were running the ball with Bijan, playing off of that with the play actions, and then just get the ball in the hands of your best playmaker. They had a screen that went for a pretty significant gain there. And overall, I've just been really enthused with what I've seen from offensive coordinator Zach Robinson and what he's been able to do with this ground game so far. And that's really what their identity on offense should be if it's, firing on all cylinders. Kirk Cousins at this point, 36 years old, coming off of an Achilles tear that it's feeding Bijan and running behind that offensive line that has been moving people up to this point, especially in the ground game. Haven't looked quite as good in the pass game, but ultimately, Bijan in this game, like I mentioned, feeding him 18 touches for 122 total yards, not to mention the fact that Tyler Algier is somehow already forgotten as a 1,000-yard rusher that he had in his rookie season just a couple years ago, and he's very capable of splitting reps with Bijan, so he had 53 yards on 9 carries. The two of them together averaged over 6.5 yards per carry, and then on top of that, you just have Kirk Cousins being the game manager that he's been for so long, but game manager is not a derogatory term towards quarterbacks. Sometimes it's just the style of play, and Kirk just making the right decisions. He was a little bit panicked and uncomfortable in week 1. Now, obviously, like I mentioned, part of that was as a result of the pressure that the Steelers were able to put on him versus what the Eagles were incapable of doing in this game. So we'll surely have to see sort of what Kirk looks like once he faces pressure once again. But he was, all things considered, pretty good in this game. 20 of 29, 241 yards, and 2 touchdowns with no interceptions. I think that's a good stat line for him, and I think that that is a winning recipe for the Falcons moving forward this season. Again, eventually Kirk will probably be tested in a couple different ways, but as for this game, I mean, he stepped up in the biggest moment, put together the game-winning drive. It was actually his, in the past 5 seasons now, 15 go-ahead touchdown passes in the fourth quarter and overtime, which leads the NFL. That's right, even over Patrick Mahomes, who just pulled off another one of those himself this past weekend. But now, all in all, I think that this is a very exciting win for the Falcons, who can hope to sort of, like I mentioned, build off of this and just stay alive in at least that divisional hunt, maybe in the playoff hunt as a whole. And on the other side, for the Eagles, I don't think you need to overreact. This is still a talented roster. We're TBD on the A.J. Brown injury. We're going to be circling back to that injury in particular later on in the show here, but it sounds like, he's going to miss a couple weeks. Even still, it is a talented team. I worry a little bit about the depth of the receiving core there, both wide receivers. I mean, Covey was the second leading targets leader in this game. Dallas Goedert wasn't very involved, so that's something that, again, game plan perspective, I think the Eagles are going to have to work on from here, be a little bit less reliant on Jalen Hurts using his legs maybe. But, defense, question marks there, sure, to some degree, but I still think they're going to be an improved unit this year. First-round pick Quinyon Mitchell, he had the tough moment on that game-winning drive where Darnell Mooney was able to shake him a little bit and pick up big yards, but he is eventually, I think, going to work his way back into it. Obviously, a huge difference in talent level that he's facing from his time at Toledo to the NFL, so he just needs to get acclimated a little bit more, but I think that he's going to be really good for them. Linebacker Zach Bonds seems like he may have been one of the most underrated signings of the offseason. Picking him up from New Orleans, putting him in a bigger role, and he currently leads the NFL in solo tackles through 2 games, so I've liked what I've seen from him. And again, final sort of bow here on the Eagles for this segment is the idea that the coaching is going to be under a microscope because the Eagles have now blown 4 leads within the final 2 minutes of a game since the start of the 2023 season, which is tied with the Falcons for the most blown leads in that time frame. If you're going toe-to-toe with the Falcons in terms of blowing leads, that is not a very good sign. So Falcons get a rejuvenating win here. We'll see if they're able to build on it, sort of what their next tests lie for them. But all in all, was a very entertaining game. Don't know if either team necessarily was excellent in this, but, I still think that much needed win for the Falcons. And as for the Eagles, it's back to the drawing board a little bit, and they have a tough game ahead of them this upcoming weekend on the road against New Orleans. So we are going to be talking further about that Eagles loss and overall just the panic level that is surrounding them, as well as some of the other championship contenders that suffered losses over the course of the weekend. Have a little scale from 1 to 10 on how panicked these teams should be. So we're going to be diving into all of that, from the Eagles to the Cowboys to the Bengals and Ravens and all of those sort of championship contenders. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news if it's some losing shit. A stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be doing a little thought experiment here where for our video viewers, I have a scale here of the NFL panic meter. This is based off of some of the top contenders that did lose their week 2 matchups this past week. The scale is on the lower end. 1 is no worries whatsoever, business as usual. And on the other end, 10 is smashing the panic button. And again, we're going to primarily limit this to the top contenders, but just as a little bit of an example here, the Carolina Panthers would be an example of what smashing the panic button looks like. We'll very briefly talk about it here. We did have the news that broke 10 minutes before our show yesterday that the Panthers are deciding to bench Bryce Young moving forward here. So had a little bit more time to, react to it. And ultimately, I mean, it's just a really bad situation there in Carolina. I really do feel for Bryce Young, because whether or not you believe that he could have been a great NFL prospect, I think that ultimately he was done no favors by Carolina, and now just so quickly into the year, it feels like his time in Carolina could be up. Now, I have maybe some outside optimism that possibly Dave Canales and the Panthers organization could work with Bryce Young behind the scenes to see if they can maybe work some things out there, if they can rebuild his confidence. But ultimately, I mean, this just kind of feels like a miss of a draft pick already, and they quite literally smashed the panic button by deciding to bench him in favor of Andy Dalton. They could actually be a little bit better with Andy Dalton under center. I mean, they did win a game last year with Andy Dalton, so I don't think that, this season already is a wash, even if Andy Dalton does lead them to a few more wins. I mean, it's still a bit of a lost season, but at the same time, to sort of add on to that as well is the reality of the situation that this season was more than anything about sort of rebuilding Bryce Young's stock and getting him back on the right track, and instead they're choosing to bench him after just 2 weeks. They are definitely in full panic mode. Again, more so just using that as an example of what the extremities of this scale looks like. But I'm going to start with last night's game and the Philadelphia Eagles, who of course had the collapse loss against the Atlanta Falcons on Monday Night Football. I think that on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the least panicked, I have them at a 3. I think that ultimately speaking, they are in a division that truthfully I don't think is going to be all that competitive. We're going to be getting to the Dallas Cowboys here shortly. So I think that the Eagles have a lot of wiggle room, and they are still a very talented roster. They were missing in my opinion, their best offensive player, A.J. Brown. You can argue Saquon Barkley either way. Not going to fight you on it. But, this team has reinforcements coming, which will definitely help them to some degree. I think that the biggest cause for concern with the Eagles is that there was such a pressure around the Eagles coaching anyways coming into this year. And I thought that on all three phases last night, the Eagles were struggling, and ultimately, I that does draw a little bit of concern for me. Now, they're still going to be on a very good path to not just make the playoffs, but likely win their division as long as they handle business. So I'm not all the way up in arms about them, but definitely some red flags if you're talking about them as Super Bowl contenders. But that being said, we are just coming out of week 2, so a whole lot of football left there. But I mentioned the Dallas Cowboys. They suffered a blowout loss to the New Orleans Saints at home in their home opener, and I have them at a 5. Now, ultimately, the Saints might end up being a very good team for this upcoming season, and you do have to take that into perspective. They also won a game in pretty convincing fashion in week 1. Now, I've talked about this before. I think that game was more so about the dysfunction of the Browns than the greatness of the Dallas Cowboys, but the Browns also just won a game, and they beat a team that is also going to be on this list later on here. But I haven't been super high about the Cowboys headed into the season, and I thought that a lot of the issues that we saw in this game in terms of Dak Prescott not looking like he's capable of elevating what is a little bit more of a short-staffed offensive weapon group around him, the offensive line really struggling in this game. Not quite sure what to make about the defensive performance in this. Again, I've been a believer in Mike Zimmer for the most part headed into the season, their new defensive coordinator, and I think that they are ultra talented. They're missing one of their best defensive players in Deron Bland, but the way that they just got steamrolled, allowing the Saints to score on each of the first 4, score a touchdown no less on each of the first 4 drives, that is a really bad sign for them. I think they can overcome it, but ultimately, I don't think that this is quite as talented of a roster as a lot of people seem to believe that they are. So ultimately, they're in a fine position here in regards to being able to make a playoff push, but when you talk about sort of how they match up against some of the top teams in the NFL, I have some real concerns there. So I have them at a 5 on the panic meter entering week 3. Now, staying in the NFC, the San Francisco 49ers suffered an upset loss to the Minnesota Vikings, and Brock Purdy did not look good in this game really whatsoever. That is marginally concerning there. We've seen at times Brock Purdy take a step back when he is missing key weapons. Ultimately, Christian McCaffrey placed on IR headed into this weekend, so he wasn't available. Deebo Samuel had a pretty good game, but he is now going to be out for some extended time here. Several weeks is what it's looking like. So that is definitely some cause for concern, but ultimately the 49ers, I think that they're going to be just fine in terms of ultimately having a pretty clear-cut run to winning their division. And then that being said, this season is obviously all about a Super Bowl run for the 49ers, so they could sort of care less in terms of what their regular season record is through the first 5-6 weeks while Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel are potentially missing time. That I'm not worried about them really all that much whatsoever, but we'll have to see as with the injuries piling up, can they sort of overcome that in these next few weeks? But I have them with a 2 on the panic meter scale. But like I mentioned, I think that they have a relatively easy path to the division. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that one of what was perceived to be their top competition in the NFC West was the Los Angeles Rams, and I think that things are getting really bad for the Rams here, really dicey as Cooper Kupp is now expected to miss a handful of weeks, likely to be placed on the injured reserve list, dealing with an ankle injury. This comes just after Puka Nacua was placed on the injured reserve list after last week. They've already lost, I should say, 2, let alone 3 starting linemen on this team. Technically, Noteboom is a backup that was playing in week 1 in replacement of Alaric Jackson, dealing with suspension, but now both of their starting guards, and Jonah Jackson and Steve Avila, are being placed on the IR. So this just kind of feels like the season from hell to some degree for the Rams, who are just all of these injuries already piling up for them. They are 0-2, just got blown out by the Cardinals. I just don't think that this is their year. And ultimately, I have them at an 8 on the panic scale. Moving on to the AFC now, the Baltimore Ravens suffered, at this point now, the biggest upset loss in terms of betting lines. Coming into it, they were 8-point favorites, I believe, is what they closed at over the Las Vegas Raiders this past weekend. And the Ravens, ultimately, I think that what this game came down to was just an inability for the offense to close out the game for them, and the defense really showing some signs of concern. Now, ultimately, the Ravens are still a very good team. I have them with a 3 on the panic scale. That's the same number as the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, in terms of the Ravens' identity, I am probably less worried about them than I am about the Eagles. The reality for the Ravens, though, is that they are 0-2 in what is an NFC North division that hasn't looked great out of the gates, but we do know is very competitive. And ultimately, I think that if they end up falling into a hole, it might be insurmountable. Now, we talked about this yesterday on the show. Steelers are the only undefeated team at this point. They still don't even know what they're doing at quarterback. The Browns are 1-1, and it's the Ravens and the Bengals at 0-2. So ultimately, the Ravens, I do think that their defense is going to have to take some steps forward here. You cannot allow yourselves to get carved up by Gardner Minshew. That is a very bad sign moving forward here, but ultimately, I think the Ravens are going to be okay. I anticipate them bouncing back, and I think that they'll be one of the top contenders in the AFC, but have to start sort of turning their season around sooner rather than later, given the urgency that is required playing in the AFC North. But just mentioned the Bengals, who are also 0-2. I have them at a 4. I'm not as concerned as a lot of people seem to be with Cincinnati. I sort of have a lot of the same sentiments that I do with the Bengals, with the Ravens. They sort of still are the team, and I understand the loss to the Patriots is a really bad one in week 1, and that is sort of especially tainting things, but the Bengals, I feel like last week competed really well with the best team in the NFL in the Kansas City Chiefs, and ultimately the fourth quarter was a meltdown, and Bengals fans got to be pulling their hairs out a little bit about not winning that game, but at the same time, that was the hardest competition, really, especially going to Arrowhead for that game. Probably the hardest competition they'll face all year. And again, they fall by 1 point because, a series of events in the fourth quarter, they sort of, it's on them for that loss. But at the same time, I think Joe Burrow is just fine. I think the offense is going to figure themselves out. I thought the defense showed a lot of improvements from last season. I feel like that we've kind of seen that through the first 2 weeks, especially the pass defense, that revamped secondary with Geno Stone and Von Bell. Both of them, giving key contributions to the Bengals. So I have them at a 4, a little bit more panicked than the Ravens, basically because of that Patriots loss and because they are a marginally worse team than the Ravens, but I'm still not worried about them all too much. And then the final team here is the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is a team that I was pretty high on coming into this year. I thought that they were going to make the playoffs, and wow, do I feel bad about that prediction right about now, because it has been an absolute mess for the Jaguars up to this point. Week 1 against Miami, coming out of the gates, that is a game that is, excusable. The Dolphins, by a lot of people's means, were expected to be a playoff team anyways. Feels like when Travis Etienne ended up fumbling into the end zone. That goes differently, and it's a whole different game. We don't play the hypotheticals here on this show, but they very easily could have won that game. Playing now at home against the Cleveland Browns, who were just an absolute dumpster fire in week one. The entire media was piling on them. And to have that sort of bad performance is just inexcusable. Neither side of the ball really looked all that good. Deshaun Watson actually looked pretty solid in this game. And I thought that, Trevor Lawrence in that offense was it's really disappointing. Getting to be, panicked for a couple reasons. Number one, that they are now 0-2 and their next two games at Buffalo and at Houston. They're going to need to win at least 9 games to make the playoffs. And if you go and you look at their schedule, I think that is pretty hard to piece together if you look at it extensively. Now, again, we're still just coming out of week 2. Whole lot can change from here. But if they fall into an 0-3, 0-4 hole with these games against Buffalo and the Texans on the road, I think it is going to be almost insurmountable to pull off a comeback into the playoffs. Now, we did see the Jaguars do a little bit of that in 2022 when they were able to, overcome a slow start and make a late season playoff run, but I don't really have faith in that right now. Not going full panic mode with them, because if they win at least one of these next 2 games, you can sort of settle down a little bit more and talk yourself into, maybe if Trevor Lawrence looks good, then they can work themselves back into it, but has not looked good whatsoever. Trevor Lawrence has not looked good whatsoever. Jaguars can't be feeling great about that contract at this current moment. They're definitely not the only ones of those contract extensions that were handed out this past offseason that haven't aged great. We're probably going to do a deeper dive into that either later this week, or we might let a couple other weeks play out from there. But feeling really bad about my Jaguars pick for the playoffs up to this point. I am on the more severe end of panicking at this current moment. But, let me know what other teams that you think should be very nervous coming out of their week 2 performances. There were a number of other teams that I wanted to throw in here, but restricted to 12 minutes on this segment. So, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. But we are now going to be switching gears a little bit, and when we come back on the other side, I am going to be handing out some week 2 awards, doing a little bit of a new segment here, talking about the best game, best win, worst loss, and all those types of best individual performances and such. So we're going to be diving into that next, but before we do so, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're introducing a new segment here. We're going to continue to revise it as we go on here, but NFL Weekly Awards. Now we're going to be talking about the biggest games, the biggest statements from teams, the worst losses, and along those lines. So if you have any suggestions as to what types of superlatives you would like to see us come out with, definitely be sure to use the comment section and let us know there. But starting off here, the best game of the week, in my opinion, was the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Like we just talked about in the last segment, I know that a lot of people are sort of trying to write off the Bengals. The fact that they were 6.5-point underdogs coming into this game, I think was very disrespectful, and ultimately they showed that they still can hang with the best of them. Now, ultimately, they fall here, so I don't want to give them too much praise, but this is a very possible playoff matchup later this year. Now, it feels like we got robbed a little bit because of the defensive pass interference penalty. Would have been just a lot more fun aesthetically if ultimately the Chiefs were able to pick up that fourth down conversion without a penalty, but got to be more disciplined on the Cincinnati side of things there. So, either way, I think that this game had a little bit of everything. We didn't even get Patrick Mahomes versus Joe Burrow at their peaks, really. I thought that, Burrow did ultimately play pretty well in this game outside of the fumble 6 that occurred, but I do think that ultimately speaking here, he played pretty well. Patrick Mahomes left some to be desired. I believe that I heard that this was the lowest amount of points lowest total amount of yards that Patrick Mahomes has had when he's played a full game. So Bengals may have sort of discovered something there in terms of what type of competition they can sort of stand against the Chiefs, but ultimately I think that this was a pretty good performance, all things considered. It was a fun game, a lot of late game dramatics there, and what would the NFL be without a little bit of controversy? So I do think that this was the best game, although last night's Monday Night Football game between the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles also would rival that. And we're not doing a worse game here, but oh my God, that Bengals-Texans game would 100% be there. And maybe that's a superlative that we add in moving forward here. But the best win of the week, I think, was the New Orleans Saints over the Dallas Cowboys. The Saints blew the doors off of the Carolina Panthers in week 1. Derek Carr looked really good in that game, and that was exciting. But as we've clearly learned, especially with this week 2 in the books, that it's hard to put much stock into any sort of a performance against the Carolina Panthers. So the Saints still had a number of questions going into Jerry World, where the Saints offense especially was lights out last season up until their playoff game against the Packers. But this was a huge statement win for the Saints, that they are to be taken seriously. Now, the consistency with the Saints is sort of what we're waiting on. They still won 9 games last year, but they had a lot of high highs and a lot of low lows. So ultimately, they are going to need to continue to prove it. They have a game upcoming this week against the Philadelphia Eagles at home that I think should be an excellent game, and they can continue to prove themselves. But again, for the offense to continue to sort of dominate through 2 weeks, 40 plus points in each of the first 2 games of the season, I think that is a great sign moving forward here. Clint Kubiak obviously getting all of his flowers right now, but we're just going to need to see it happen a little bit more consistently for the Saints. But I thought this was an excellent win. I would also give as an honorable mention the Arizona Cardinals just laying the Los Angeles Rams out in that game, blowing them out. Kyler Murray looking excellent. Marvin Harrison Jr. exploding. I thought that ultimately the Cardinals were also in that conversation, but I also think that the Saints are very depleted at this moment. Cowboys are more seen, at least in my eyes, as a team that could be a playoff threat, so I'm giving it to the Saints. The worst loss, Jacksonville Jaguars, and I think this one should be pretty consensus. What an awful game from the Jaguars. And this is from somebody who has been a believer that the Jaguars made the right decision in deciding to pay Trevor Lawrence, and that their defense was going to take steps forward this year. Doug Peterson was going to be able to bounce back, and sort of none of those things really, checked off in this past game. Now, defense, I'm still not out on them. I thought they played okay, but They were also facing Deshaun Watson. But to lose a game where the Browns, I believe, were 3 of 12. I can double check here. I think it was 3 of 12 on third down conversions. It was 2 of 14, so even worse. And, 13 penalties for in this game for double checking here actually my notes, but it was so sloppy really on both sides of this game. In the loss, it was the Browns who had 13 penalties for 100 yards, and they still end up winning this game. It is, a real indictment on where the Jaguars are at. If you really want to be an apologist, you can talk about the fact that it was pouring and offenses might not have been good on either side here, but even some of the general decision making with Trevor Lawrence was very much lackluster, and I am sufficiently disappointed to say the least. But would also throw the Eagles in probably as another honorable mention, considering the fact that they blew the game in the fashion that they did, but they still, sort of outperformed the Falcons for the majority of the game. Jaguars were just a mess pretty much from start to finish, so they get marked down here as my worst loss. The best individual performance, I have Alvin Kamara. And to see him have this sort of, possible rejuvenation is really fun to see. Kamara is somebody who has had a very weird career arc, and I don't know if he's necessarily gotten the love publicly overall throughout his career for what a star he's been, but he was just on one in this game. On the ground, it was 20 carries for 115 yards and 3 touchdowns. Add to that his 2 receptions for 65 yards and a touchdown. Kamara was incredible altogether, and if the Saints are going to be a prominent force in the NFL this season, it's going to have to be the balance. Derek Carr has looked excellent, but I don't think it can solely be the Derek Carr show. The balance that Kamara provides as well on the ground. I think that the Saints offensive line as well definitely deserves some credit as well. Not a lot of people out there are big offensive lineman fans, but their 2 tackles in Taliesin Fuaga and Trevor Penning, I just think that they have a nastiness to them where they just get out and move people, and I'm very encouraged by what I've seen from the Saints. Now, I don't really have an offensive honorable mention here, but what I would say is I might add Defensive Player of the Week into this category as well, which would easily have to be Aiden Hutchinson with his 4.5 sacks. So if that's something that you think that we should include in these NFL awards, weekly awards, I should say, let us know in the comments section. But finally, the biggest red flag that I saw from this past week is the Philadelphia Eagles coaching staff, I should say. And ultimately, I don't want to kick a dead horse here. Everybody is slaughtering the Eagles coaching staff right now, but it's just the reality of the situation as well, that they sort of handed that game to the Atlanta Falcons in a couple different ways. And I talked about this in the game breakdown, that offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, I thought, had a tough game. Vic Fangio, the defensive coordinator, didn't put together a great game plan. And then obviously the decision making at the end of the game is really what sort of steals all the headlines here. But just all in all, the Eagles are a talented team, but they have to be able to get out of their own way. And that's what we didn't see. We didn't see them do that last season. And now, it's just really disappointing to see this happen in this game as well, where they're going to be under the microscope for this upcoming season. Last season they basically chalked it up to both of our coordinators last year weren't good. So, okay, you move on from them. You bring in 2 new coordinators. Now is where Nick Sirianni's back is against the wall. And even if he is sort of a locker room guy and, fires up the Eagles players, you gotta be more well composed as a team as a whole, and that I do not think that they were in that collapse loss to the Falcons. But another red flag that I would throw in there as well of an honorable mention is the Ravens passing defense, allowing Gardner Minshew to be basically flawless in the second half. That is a very bad sign. The Raiders got nothing done on the ground. I'm a big fan of a lot of players on that Ravens front seven, and I think that they should be, all things considered, pretty good in that secondary. Nate Wiggins not in for this game. I don't know how much he is a transformative talent in year one and how much you can really rely on him to fully pull it together. I understand you're playing Davante Adams, who is still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, but I mean, Gardner Minshew in that Raiders quarterback room is one of the worst in the NFL. And Gardner played okay, so I don't want to, kill him in a moment where the Raiders actually looked pretty good, all things considered, and Gardner looked pretty good. But, that being said, we can acknowledge that it was great for the Raiders. That's not a team that the Ravens should allow to throw all over them the way that they did. But again, sort of first rendition here of the weekly NFL awards. Let me know what sorts of awards you think we should be handing out. But we are now going to move on here. And when we come back on the other side, we're going to be discussing some of the top fantasy football stars that suffered serious injuries this past weekend, talking about what the timeline appears to be at this current moment and what implications it may have on your fantasy football league. So we are going to be diving into all of that, but before we do so, we're going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are now going to be analyzing some of the key losses to fantasy football stars due to injuries. It was unfortunately a pretty bad week overall for some of the top fantasy football stars in regards to injury news. So we're going to be diving into each of those situations and talking about the implications that come from there. We're going to start with the Philadelphia Eagles, who played last night without their star wide receiver, A.J. Brown, who is dealing with a hamstring injury. Brown called it a freak injury where he just sort of seemed to have pulled his hamstring in practice, I believe it was, on Friday afternoon. And the Eagles and Brown have been pretty vague overall about what it is specifically, but A.J. Brown did just tell ESPN's Lisa Salters that he's going to be out for a couple weeks. That was last night during the Eagles game that she reported on that. And I think that ultimately, in terms of how this sort of works out from a fantasy football perspective, Devontae Smith, we saw him last night able to shine. He was really the only wide receiver or just in general pass catcher that was a consistent threat to the Falcons defense, and that's why Jalen Hurts targeted him 10 times. He was one of, A.J. Brown got paid this offseason, but as did Devontae Smith. So Devontae Smith's stock for the next couple weeks definitely up there. Devontae, great player anyways, probably a wide receiver to play anyways, even with A.J. Brown being available to them. But now at this point as well, with this sort of injury news, Devontae Smith is in that wide receiver one territory. Now, last night, you can double check here, he probably had around 15 points in standard scoring. I have him myself in a PPR league where he scored me, I believe it was 17. So I think that ultimately, when he finished with 7 receptions, 76 yards, and a touchdown. So, depending on your league scoring, you're looking at somewhere between 13 and 21 points. But Devontae is going to have to be a must-play for the foreseeable future here. I was a little bit worried last night as to, what happens if opposing teams just sell out to Devontae Smith? And the answer is doesn't really matter. There aren't a lot of other options for the Eagles. I mean, Dallas Goedert, I would imagine that after last night only receiving 3 targets, I believe it was, that Kellen Moore is going to, the Eagles offensive coordinator, he's going to sort of recalibrate there, try and work him into the game more. It's also interesting, Jahan Dotson was a trade acquisition for the Eagles right towards the end of training camp that maybe we could see him sort of work his way into the system. He at least got a couple weeks in training camp there. Not that he's going to be ultra familiar with the system and familiar with Jalen Hurts, but I think that, somebody at least to maybe keep an eye on. But I think the player that benefits from this more than anything is Saquon Barkley. And yes, obviously ends up having the drop on 3rd and short that everybody's killing him for. But I think that that's something that they're probably going to try and work in a little bit more, is him and the receiving game, because I just don't feel like Jalen Hurts carrying the ball 12 times for himself is all that sustainable, especially considering the injuries that he suffered last season to his lower body. I believe specifically it was his knee, that they're going to want to take the pressure off of him a little bit. And I think Saquon is going to get a lot of touches in these next few weeks, especially so with A.J. Brown out. So I think that ultimately Eagles are a pretty short team in terms of depth for pass catchers, so does open up a lot of sort of alternative routes here for Saquon Barkley. But moving on here, Isaiah Pacheco ended up fracturing his fibula in the Kansas City Chiefs game in the final 2 minutes, them versus the Cincinnati Bengals, and this is just such a disheartening loss. Pacheco, one of my favorite running backs in the league, he has been excellent to start this season, and now he goes down, and really the Chiefs don't have all that much of backup options for them. Carson Steele was sort of their second leading rusher this past week in terms of attempts, that maybe he could be worth a pickup and see if he's a flyer for flex. The Chiefs internally seem to love him a lot. He is supposedly a grinder behind the scenes and somebody that, yes, he did end up fumbling in this week 2 game against the Bengals, but maybe he could sort of, now that he is a little bit more the bell cow, get some more touches. I think it would be sort of at best a flex start for you, maybe an RB2 if you're desperate, because especially the Chiefs don't really have anybody else. They do have Samaje Perine, who maybe they'll utilize a little bit more in the passing game, so if you're banking on him being a PPR running back, I definitely wouldn't do so there. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is still on the team. I'm not sure where he's at in his injury recovery process. Maybe he takes over a little bit more. I mean, ultimately, I just don't think that the ground game is going to be good for the Chiefs during this absence here. We'll have to see about that, but probably means more touches for some of those receivers. I don't know. The Travis Kelce situation there in Kansas City is an interesting one, because I thought that Kelce was going to have a quieter season this year anyways, just based off of the fact I think they're going to want to preserve him as much as possible for the playoffs. Now, do they sort of start to work him in a little bit heavier usage now that Pacheco is out? I'm not sure about that. The Chiefs are another one of those teams where it's just they know that they're playing for a Super Bowl. They don't really care about these regular season games. So maybe Kelce gets a couple more looks, but ultimately I don't expect the usage of him in the regular season to be night and day now with Pacheco out. But I think it more so benefits the likes of Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy. Also, the fact that Hollywood Brown is expected to miss the majority of the year means that you don't have to worry about another mouth to feed in that offense. We'll see. I still like Rashee Rice as a play far more than I do Xavier Worthy. Worthy will be an interesting, an intriguing flex start every couple weeks based off of matchups. I don't think that he's going to consistently get the touches that a lot of other fans seem to at this point. We know the explosion with him and all of that, but we still haven't really seen himself consistently get open with his route running, which I think is probably what the Chiefs are going to, work with him behind the scenes throughout this season and for the foreseeable future. But Rashee Rice has been incredible out of the gates here, and he has been, so sturdy. You want to talk about route running and just finding open space. That's been Rice's game so far, and I talked about this before. It's almost a little bit Travis Kelce-ish in terms of working that intermediate game, finding open space, and just picking up a couple extra yards after contact. I think that he's been really impressive there, and he's somebody that I think is going to be, a high wide receiver 2 option. Could be a low wide receiver 1 just based off of the fact that he has Patrick Mahomes behind him. Probably would have to see a little bit more consistency in terms of, how Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs want to play this for the weeks coming forward. But ultimately, I think that they're going to have to lean a little bit more on their passing game in these next handful of weeks, and we'll see what types of implications that has in terms of who gets the majority of the work end there. Cooper Kupp suffered an ankle injury, expected to be put on the IR. This is a situation where, the Rams are just so distraught right now, and it's wide receivers from a fantasy football standpoint, but then also, your first inclination might be, oh, well, maybe that means Kyren Williams can take over a little bit more. And while I'm not saying that that's impossible, the Rams have already seen 3 offensive linemen start and then get placed on the injured reserve list, so I don't know how they're going to be good, how good they're going to be in the trenches either. Kyren, maybe if you're in a PPR league, he is able to sort of emerge there, but I don't see him topping, maybe a mid to low RB2 spot for a lot of fantasy football users, especially, again, depending on if you are in a PPR league or not. Production probably only gets worse from there, so I'm pretty pessimistic in general here about the Rams. If there's a wide receiver that could potentially take a jump here, maybe you get lucky with Tutu Atwell emerging out of the slot. Their Rams, considering all the injuries they're dealing with on the front line, probably the idea of them throwing quick routes to a slot wide receiver, I think it's on the table for them, but I would probably stay away from the Rams, generally speaking, here in fantasy football. And then a couple injuries for the San Francisco 49ers. Christian McCaffrey is going to be placed on the IR as expected, or he is out for at least until week 6, and then we'll sort of have to see from there. I would have to imagine the 49ers are going to be in no rush to bring him back for a couple reasons. One being the Achilles is what's bothering him, and Achilles is never anything that you want to play with. And then on top of that as well, just the fact that the 49ers are in a pretty comfortable situation overall here in terms of they still are. I know they just lost to the Vikings. They're still one of the best teams in the NFL, and I don't think that they're all too concerned about regular season wins or losses. So feels like maybe a spot where, we could see McCaffrey make his return. I know he's out until at least week 6. I wonder if they sort of hold off even that much more so for week 7 against the Kansas City Chiefs, where Super Bowl rematch, I'm sure they're going to, be motivated to win that game. So, McCaffrey going to be out for the foreseeable future, but you got another 100-yard rushing game from Jordan Mason, so he feels like, especially behind that offensive line in San Francisco, that he can be a legitimate running back 2 option for now. Now, I can't say that I've known a ton about who Jordan Mason is up until week 1, so, I'm not going to die on that hill necessarily, but he's been really impressive up to this point. I expect that to continue on, but the other injury for the 49ers, Deebo Samuel, suffers a calf injury and is expected to be out a couple of weeks, according to 49ers head coach Kyle Shanahan, which I think we saw it last week. The biggest beneficiary out of this is George Kittle, who, had a massive game for the 49ers in this game, and I think he's going to be the top guy for them. Brandon Ayuk still hasn't seemed totally comfortable yet since sort of coming back from that holdout. He's still a good player. I think he's going to be fine in the long run here. Maybe just needs to shake off a little bit of rust, but again, Kittle is really the player that I'm looking at from this perspective, that he is going to ultimately benefit a lot. 7 catches, 76 yards, and a touchdown in this game. Again, Ayuk, fine, 4 catches, 43 yards, but Ayuk feels like right now a flex player that, has the upside of working into that wide receiver too. But George Kittle is, maybe going to be the tight end one for this upcoming season. Nobody in that tight end position has really emerged yet. So I'm buying stock in George Kittle as much as I can at this point. Definitely not an easy player to get a hold of anyways, but I think that he's going to be huge for the 49ers for these next handful of weeks while they are shorthanded. But those are really the significant injuries that are expected to have players miss time. Justin Jefferson expected to be back next week. Tajay Spears expects to be back next week. So I believe I covered all the bases on some of the key fantasy football players. But let me know if you have any other questions on some of the top players that may be dealing with injuries. But that is going to wrap up what we have for NFL for the day. We're going to take one last break here, and when we come back on the other side, I am going to be giving my thoughts on CBS Sports' top 30, the rankings for all 30 NBA head coaches that they just put out a couple days ago. So we're going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we're going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we are going to be reacting to the list that Sam Quinn of CBS Sports put out, ranking all 30 NBA head coaches. He put them into tiers, so we're just going to be giving some thoughts on how he did with the list as a whole. So without further ado, getting into the first slate of teams here. For our video viewers, we are looking at tiers 9 through 7. It was 9 different tiers here. Ultimately, it is 30 J.J. Redick, 29 Brian Keefe, 28 Charles Lee, 27 Jordy Fernandez, 26 Darko Rajakovic. Sorry for the mispronunciation there. 25 Chauncey Billups, 24 Billy Donovan, 23 J.B. Bickerstaff, 22 Doc Rivers, 21 Kenny Atkinson, 20 Willie Green, and 19 Jamal Mosley. So obviously J.J. Redick, just because he has the Lakers job, because he's J.J. Redick and he's a big name. Some fans might take offense to the fact that J.J. Redick is ranked 30th. I don't think it's all that off base, given the fact that there is zero coaching experience that can give us a real gauge on how good of a coach he will be. Now, I think that he does have a lot of upside as a coach. I talked about this before. I kind of wish he went anywhere but the Lakers to start his career, because he's going to be in the pressure cooker from day one. But ultimately, J.J. Redick, it's clear. If you listen to the Old Man and the Three or his podcast with LeBron James, J.J. Redick knows ball big time, and I think that it's going to translate to the NBA. I think that he could definitely be a riser as the year goes on, but again, somebody who doesn't even have experience at the high school level or above, I believe is the case with J.J. I don't have a problem with Quinn putting him at number 30 on this list. Number 28, Charles Lee. Not going to spend too much time on the bottom of this list necessarily, but I'm a Celtics fan. I'm a very big fan of Charles Lee. He's coming off of winning a championship with the Celtics. He is a hard-nosed guy, very well-renowned. He was once with the Milwaukee Bucks as well, I believe, when they won in 2021. Then was the lead assistant there, became the lead assistant with the Celtics last season, and I think that he has a chance to do some really big things with the Charlotte Hornets, who have been lacking culture these past handful of years. And now, additionally, I think that the Hornets have their hands on a couple really hard-nosed athletes in terms of Brandon Miller, who is a star in the making, in my opinion, and somebody that the Hornets can really build around. Takes a ton of pride on his defense just as much as his offense. And then they just drafted Tijan Salon with the 6th overall pick from France. A lot of NBA fans don't know a lot about him, but this guy is a grinder, and I think that the two of them together with Charles Lee and the intensity that he's going to bring, I think that he's at least going to be a culture setter for this Hornets organization that desperately needs it. Also want to give a little bit love to Darko, Jordy Fernandez here, where I think that ultimately, Jordy, I want to give credit to Darko because he had to deal with the tanking situation in Toronto last season, but I thought that there were, a number of times where he was able to sort of get that emotion out of his players, and another guy that I think could be a culture setter and I think could, jump up this list. But that was the tier 9 of We Don't Know Enough. Tier 8 here, Chauncey Billups, Billy Donovan, JB Bickerstaff, and Doc Rivers. Rivers at 22 feels low to me. Now, I understand not a popular coach with a lot of NBA fans whatsoever. I do feel like it's a little bit low, especially coming behind the promising young coaches tier ahead of him with Kenny Atkinson, Willie Green, Jamal Mosley. I'm a big fan of Jamal Mosley. I like Willie Green as well. I think that ultimately, what has Kenny Atkinson really done to prove that he's better than Doc Rivers? And again, yeah, sure, the Bucks were a worse team record-wise when Doc Rivers took over, but there's a reason why the Bucks ended up firing Adrian Griffin early in the season. It's because they weren't playing a winning brand of basketball. Now Doc gets a full year with Milwaukee. I think he is going to be better this year. Not saying I'd throw him into the top 10 or anywhere near that, but Doc at 22, a little bit low. And when you look at sort of this next tier as well, I mean, I look at somebody like Quinn Snyder sitting at 16. It's like, yeah, well, Quinn Snyder did definitely have some good years in Utah. And I was encouraged for the Hawks when they decided to hire him headed into, 2 seasons ago. But it hasn't shown me anything really in the past couple years. Jason Kidd as well, somebody that I do think that Kidd is sort of one of those polarizing NBA head coaches. Hard to put him at 18 considering that the Mavericks did make some serious adjustments in the second half of the season, but was that about Jason Kidd or was that about the talent that was actually on the roster? I think it was a little bit more so about their additions of PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford, but Kidd at 18, I'm not going to be too up in arms about it. The fact that Taylor Jenkins, though, and Michael Malone were this low on the list, that didn't sit great with me. And it's tough because you look at the names ahead, and it's not like at this point, I think it does sort of go to show how much depth there is at coaching in the NBA. So, that's kind of one of the takeaways I got from this list as well, looking at all of it. But I feel like that they should have been maybe a little bit higher. And unfortunately, one of those names that I would have bumped down is Greg Popovich. I mean, it's tough. I totally understand where Quinn was coming from when he put this list together, that he didn't want to leave Greg Popovich out of the top half of NBA coaches, but it's just an interesting thing. Yeah, sure, the talent has been really, really bad surrounding the Spurs, so I'm definitely not going to knock Greg Popovich. He's one of the greatest NBA head coaches of all time, but we also saw in an NFL comparison here, which isn't totally fair, but Bill Belichick also having a huge hand in the way that the franchise goes about business, and ultimately, I don't even think it's that the game passed him by, and Greg Popovich is far more friendly and, with his players and everything than Belichick was at the end there, but might just, sort of be past the prime at this point. So I probably would have put Popovich a little bit lower. Please don't skewer me in the comment section there, but that takes us to the fourth tier here, which he calls the obvious floor raisers: Mike Brown, Chris Finch, Joe Mazzulla, Tom Thibodeau, Mike Budenholzer, and Ime Udoka. I would say that Joe Mazzulla being at number 11 feels disrespectful to some degree. Now, I understand not a ton of proven entity there, as with Ime Udoka as well, who I do think is one of the best coaches in the NBA. Yes, I know I'm a Celtics fan. I'm highlighting a lot of Celtics guys here. I promise I am an unbiased analyst here. But, I think it's interesting, and we're going to get into that third tier after this. But a lot of other young and unproven head coaches who haven't had nearly the same success. So I feel like, and having success, especially in the NBA, is sort of relative because it's so much about the player talent that you have. But I feel like Mazzulla, just the way that, and this is a proven season for him in general, because of the fact that he did just lose Charles Lee, his head assistant. Jeff Van Gundy was a senior advisor for the Celtics this past season. He's now moving on to the Clippers, so this is going to be more so in the hands of Mazzulla. I can't say I'm outraged by the fact that he's at 11, behind Tom Thibodeau. I agree. I feel like it's neck and neck with Ime Udoka, but I am also a big Udoka fan, even despite sort of the nonsense that took place at the end of his Celtics tenure. But I think he has a very bright future. But it does sort of pour me into this next tier here, where the third tier is just calls the Wonderkins of Will Hardy and Mark Daigneault. And both of them very good, promising young head coaches. But realistically, I mean, what have either of them done really up to this point? Will Hardy, another former Celtics guy, by the way, but I really like Will Hardy. I was sort of, especially after that Udoka situation, I was a little bit upset that Hardy was able to, walk away, because I would have definitely liked him as the replacement for Ime Udoka, but I think things worked out there in Boston, so can't complain too much. But him and Daigneault being where they are in this situation, I feel like Daigneault, and maybe it's that I don't know enough about the specifics of what he does, and if you are more familiar, definitely be sure to let me know in the comment section your defense of Daigneault. I just feel like he also has sort of benefited from having a very talented young team that hasn't necessarily been given that same credit until this past year when they were the 1 seed, and they haven't really done anything yet. Now, that's not a fair statement whatsoever. Chet Holmgren just played his first full season. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is emerging as one of the superstars in the NBA. Jalen Williams continues to improve. So there's so much room to grow with this entire roster, and it's not fair of me to hold the Thunder to a higher standard than what they are. That being said, though, I also do kind of feel like the Thunder have been able to sort of skate by with very little expectations, even though they are talented. Now, from the 2023 season, big issue is that with Chet injured, they didn't even have a center. So I can't bury Daigneault all too much. I'm curious what makes him so special that already he's a top 6 head coach in the NBA, where he has also benefited from having overall a very talented team. So I would probably knock him down. It's not even that I'd knock him down. I just feel like when you look at, we'll sort of go back here for the visual viewers, between Will Hardy and Mark Daigneault and some of the coaches that were in that tier just below them of a Mazzulla, Thibodeau, Udoka, you could maybe even throw Chris Finch in there. I also love Mike Brown, but, I don't think that Hardy and Daigneault are a full tier above some of the guys that are in that 13 to 8 range. Now, if you have a counter argument, I'd love to hear it in the comment section. Not married to these opinions, but it's maybe more so just confusion to me why Dagnall and Hardy get to already be just outside of the elites ahead of some of those other coaches that have shown a lot of success, especially Thibodeau. It's one thing if you want to bang on Missoula and Udoka, who don't have quite as much experience, Mike Brown as well, but Tibbs has been in the league forever and he's had a lot of success during that time. So I feel like them being on different tiers doesn't really sit all that well with me. Tier 2, the elites: Ty Lue, Steve Kerr, Rick Carlisle, Nick Nurse, and then Eric Spoelstra on his own tier, understandably, at number 1 to close out the top 5 there. I don't have many complaints there. I do feel like Nick Nurse, and I really do like Nick Nurse, and I think I'm not upset by him being here whatsoever. It is a little bit weird to me that he's just sort of consensus number 2 when Nurse hasn't really done anything since the 2019 championship, where I think even more so impressive than beating the Warriors in the finals given the injuries was sort of innovating the wall to use against Giannis, beating what was to some degree a better team in the Philadelphia 76ers in the semifinals as well. But Sam Quinn, the author of this article, he also talks about how, even after they lost Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green, they were still the number 2 seed in the East. Okay. That doesn't really move me. They ended up losing in the second round anyways. So I'm not really sure what the accomplishments for Nick Nurse within the past 5 years are. Now, he didn't necessarily get a totally fair shot anyways with the Sixers this past season, given the injury to Joel Embiid. They were on a pretty good pace up until that took place, but ultimately, I can't be too mad at it because I've been a Nurse fan for a lot of his career since taking over for the Raptors. But, I think overall it's a fine list. Maybe I look into making a list of my own. It's not totally fair of me to just sit here and criticize and not make my own. It's also NFL season, so I can't say I've been super in the weeds with NBA just yet. But that being said, we're just outside of a month away from the beginning of the 2024 season, which I am 24-25 season. So definitely looking forward to that. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back tomorrow afternoon with same time as always at 2:00 p.m. Eastern. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn.